Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a financial consultant in downtown Phoenix. For the past 4 years, I thought I was building something beautiful with my family. I was wrong. When I discovered my parents had secretly rewritten their will to exclude me entirely while leaving everything to my sister who'd contributed nothing, I felt like my world was crashing down. But what I didn't know was that our family attorney had been documenting every conversation, every lie, every calculated move they made against me. What those recordings revealed would expose a level of betrayal I never saw coming. Have you ever given everything to people who were planning to give you nothing in return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to that scorching Tuesday morning in September, when everything I believed about my family shattered like glass hitting concrete. The Arizona sun was already brutal at 8 in the morning as I pulled into the parking lot of Sunshine Valley Storage Solutions, the family business my parents built from absolutely nothing 25 years ago. The metal buildings gleamed silver against the desert landscape, rows upon rows of storage units that represented my father's American dream and my mother's tireless bookkeeping. I'd been making this drive from Phoenix every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 years now, ever since Dad's stroke left him unable to handle the day-to-day operations. The 30-minute commute had become as natural as breathing, my Honda Civic navigating the familiar route while I mentally prepared for another day of juggling my consulting clients with keeping the family business alive. The storage facility wasn't glamorous, but it was profitable, steady, and something my parents had poured their hearts into building. Walking through the front office, I breathed in the familiar scent of industrial carpet and the coffee Mom always had brewing by 6 in the morning. The walls were covered with certificates from the local Chamber of Commerce, photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and framed newspaper articles about small business success in our community. This place represented everything my parents valued, about hard work and determination. "Morning, sweetheart," Mom called from behind the reception desk, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 62, Linda Martinez still carried herself with the precision of someone who'd spent decades managing every detail of a growing business. She was sorting through a stack of late payment notices, her reading glasses perched on her nose, as she made notes in her careful handwriting. Dad emerged from the back office, moving more slowly than he used to, but still maintaining that confident stride that had intimidated delinquent customers for decades. At 65, Carlos Martinez looked every inch the successful businessman he'd become, even if the stroke had forced him to rely on me for the more complex financial decisions. His thick gray mustache twitched as he spotted me, the same expression he'd worn when I was little, and he was proud of something I'd accomplished. "Rachel's here, Linda. Maybe she can figure out why our software keeps rejecting these payment updates." It was always like this. When technology got complicated, when numbers didn't add up, when vendors needed negotiating, they called me. When there were community events, grand openings, or photo opportunities for the local business association, they called my sister Melissa. I didn't mind the work. Sunshine Valley Storage had put me through college, paid for my business degree, and taught me everything I knew about customer service and financial management. I genuinely loved helping preserve what my parents had built, watching their dream continue to grow even as they moved toward retirement. The business was thriving under my financial guidance, expanding from 200 units to over 400 in just the past 3 years. Melissa loved the business too, just in a completely different way. At 26, my younger sister had discovered that being the daughter of successful small business owners gave her credibility as a lifestyle blogger. Her Instagram account, Desert Life with Mel, featured beautiful sunset photos taken at the storage facility, inspirational quotes about entrepreneurship, and carefully curated content about growing up in a family business. Her 15,000 Followers ate up every post about authentic small-town values and the importance of supporting local enterprises. "Melissa's doing that podcast interview today," Mom mentioned casually, updating customer files on her ancient computer. "That business show wants to feature her insights about marketing for family companies." I nodded, trying not to feel the familiar sting of disappointment. I had an MBA in business administration and 4 years of hands-on experience growing their revenue. But somehow Melissa's social media presence made her the marketing expert in their eyes. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I spent my mornings managing their accounts receivable and my afternoons consulting for other businesses, Melissa spent her time creating content about the entrepreneurial lifestyle. While I negotiated better rates with suppliers and implemented systems that increased their efficiency, she posted motivational quotes about perseverance and hard work. While I used my evenings to review their books and plan expansion strategies, she attended networking events where she spoke about the challenges of being a young woman in business. Don't misunderstand me. I wasn't jealous of Melissa's success or bitter about her opportunities. I was proud that she'd found a way to build her own career, even if it sometimes felt like she was building it on the foundation I was maintaining. What bothered me was the subtle way our roles had been defined over the years. I was the problem solver, the one who handled the difficult conversations and made the tough decisions. She was the face of the family, the one who represented us at public events and made everything look effortless. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. I reviewed payment reports, called customers whose accounts were overdue, and updated the financial projections I'd been working on for their retirement planning. Dad sat with me for an hour, asking questions about cash flow and expressing amazement at how much the business had grown since I'd taken over the financial management. Mom brought us coffee and mentioned how grateful they were to have someone they could trust with the numbers. These moments felt precious to me. Despite the complexity of our family dynamics, despite the way my contributions sometimes felt invisible, I treasured the knowledge that I was genuinely helping them build security for their future. At 29, I earned good money from my consulting practice, but I'd never charged my parents a penny for the 20 hours a week I spent managing their business operations. It was my contribution to the family legacy, my way of honoring everything they'd sacrificed to build this life for Melissa and me. Around 11, I was organizing invoices in Dad's office when I noticed something that would change everything. Tucked between old tax documents and vendor contracts was a folder I'd never seen before, labeled in Mom's handwriting. Estate planning documents. Private. The folder was thick, official-looking, and positioned in a way that suggested it was being hidden rather than stored. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that. But something about the deliberate concealment made my hands shake as I opened it. Inside were legal documents, freshly printed and notarized, dated just 8 weeks earlier. I expected to see the usual estate planning materials, perhaps updates to the will they'd mentioned wanting to revise. Instead, I found myself staring at words that made the room spin around me. Last Will and Testament of Carlos and Linda Martinez was printed across the top in formal legal typeface. Below that, in clear, unambiguous language, was a declaration that would redefine everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. We hereby bequeath all assets, including Sunshine Valley Storage Solutions, real estate holdings, investment accounts, and personal property, to our daughter Melissa Martinez, with full confidence in her ability to continue our business legacy. My name appeared exactly once in the entire document. We acknowledge our daughter Rachel Martinez, but believe the business requires leadership that prioritizes growth and innovation over traditional financial management. I read those words 3 times before they penetrated my consciousness. 8 weeks ago. This will was dated 8 weeks ago, which was exactly 2 weeks after I'd personally guaranteed a $60,000 equipment loan that allowed them to purchase new security systems for the entire facility. 2 weeks after I'd used my excellent credit score and my personal assets as collateral because the bank wouldn't approve the loan based solely on the business's credit history. 2 weeks after I'd essentially risked my own financial future to fund their expansion plans. The timeline was like a slap across the face. While I was at the bank, signing documents that made me personally responsible for their debt, they were at their attorney's office, signing documents that would ensure I'd never see a penny of the business I was literally financing. While I was explaining to loan officers why this investment would benefit the family business, they were explaining to their lawyer why the family business should belong to only one family member. My hands were trembling as I continued reading through the documents. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There were detailed provisions about Melissa's inheritance, instructions for business transition, even specifications about how she should handle various aspects of operations. But there were no provisions for me, no acknowledgement of my contributions, no recognition of the fact that I'd been managing their finances for 4 years. According to this legal document, I simply didn't exist as a relevant part of their future. The cruelest part wasn't just the exclusion. It was the reasoning they'd provided to their attorney, carefully documented in the notes attached to the will. Rachel has her own successful consulting practice and doesn't need the additional responsibility of managing the storage business. Melissa has shown genuine passion for entrepreneurship and marketing, skills that will be essential as the business continues to grow. Passion for entrepreneurship. I'd been working unpaid for 4 years, managing every aspect of their business operations. But Melissa's Instagram posts about entrepreneurship somehow demonstrated more passion than my actual entrepreneurship. Marketing skills. I'd implemented the customer retention programs that increased their occupancy rate from 70% to 96%. But Melissa's lifestyle blog somehow represented superior marketing expertise. The most devastating part was a handwritten note in my father's careful script, attached to the lawyer's recommendations. Rachel is the type of person who succeeds no matter what. She doesn't need our help to build a good life. Melissa needs more support and guidance to reach her potential. I stared at that note until the words blurred together. The type of person who succeeds no matter what. It sounded like a compliment, but in the context of this will, it was a justification for abandonment. They were taking my strengths and using them as reasons to exclude me from the family legacy I'd helped preserve. They were punishing me for being capable, reliable, and self-sufficient. The office felt smaller suddenly, the desert heat pressing against the windows like a physical weight. I could hear Mom talking to a customer in the front office, her voice cheerful and professional. I could hear Dad moving around in the storage units, checking locks and greeting tenants like he did every morning. Normal sounds of a normal business day, while I sat surrounded by evidence that nothing about our family was normal or honest. I thought about all the Tuesday and Thursday mornings I'd driven here instead of focusing on my own business. I thought about the weekends I'd spent updating their computer systems while Melissa traveled to influencer conferences. I thought about the evenings I'd spent balancing their books while she attended networking events where she spoke about the challenges of family business management. I thought about the $60,000 I'd personally guaranteed, money that was still being deducted from my checking account every month to pay for improvements to a business I would never inherit. Most of all, I thought about the conversations we'd had about their retirement, their plans, their hopes for the future of Sunshine Valley Storage. They'd asked for my input on expansion strategies, my advice on financial planning, my thoughts on how to position the business for long-term success. Every one of those conversations had been a lie, a performance designed to keep me engaged and contributing while they planned to cut me out entirely. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't immediately process the full scope of what I was discovering. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or a moment of poor judgment. This was a systematic plan, developed over months, designed to extract maximum benefit from my contributions while ensuring I received nothing in return. They'd used my expertise to grow the business, my credit to finance improvements, and my time to maintain operations. all while planning to give everything to someone who'd contributed nothing but social media content. I carefully placed the documents back in their folder, my hands steadier now that the initial shock was wearing off. I walked to the front office where Mom was still working at her computer, her expression focused and content. She looked up when I approached, smiling the same warm smile she'd given me every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 years. "All finished with those invoices, sweetheart?" she asked, as if nothing had changed, as if I hadn't just discovered that. She'd been planning to erase me from the family future while I worked to secure it. "Mom," I said quietly, placing the folder on her desk, "we need to talk." The color drained from Mom's face so quickly I thought she might faint. She stared at the folder like it contained a bomb rather than legal documents, her hands frozen above her computer keyboard. For a moment, the only sound in the office was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of a customer loading boxes into their storage unit. "Oh, Rachel," she whispered, removing her reading glasses with shaking fingers. "You weren't supposed to find that." Her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Not surprise exactly, but resignation mixed with something that looked like guilt. "But I did find it, Mom. So now what?" I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "When exactly were you planning to tell me that I've been working for free to build something I'll never inherit?" She closed her laptop and folded her hands in her lap. The same gesture she'd made when I was a teenager and she needed to deliver disappointing news. "Sit down, honey. This is more complicated than it looks." I remained standing. "It looks pretty straightforward to me. You and Dad decided that 4 years of my life, $60,000 of my personal guarantee, and every Tuesday and Thursday morning mean nothing. What's complicated about that?" "You don't understand," she said, her voice taking on that pleading tone she used when she wanted to avoid confrontation. "You're so successful, Rachel. Your consulting business is thriving. You have that beautiful apartment in Phoenix. You're building your own life. You don't need this place the way Melissa does." The logic was so twisted it took me a moment to process it. "So because I'm successful, I don't deserve to inherit anything from the family business I helped build. Because I've worked hard to create my own life, I shouldn't be included in the family legacy." "It's not about deserving," Mom said quickly, standing up and walking around the desk toward me. "It's about need. You're the strong one, Rachel. You've always been the strong one. You'll thrive no matter what happens. But Melissa, she needs more support, more guidance. This business could give her the foundation she needs to really succeed." There it was, the phrase that would haunt me for months afterward. "You're the strong one." As if strength was a disqualification rather than an asset. As if being capable meant I deserved less rather than more. As if all the times I'd solved their problems, handled their crises, and sacrificed my own time to keep their business running had somehow made me less worthy of their consideration. "Where's Dad?" I asked, looking toward his office. "He's doing the morning unit inspections," Mom replied, wrapping her arms around herself like she was cold, despite the desert heat outside. "Rachel, please don't make this into something ugly. We love both of you girls equally." Love. The word sat between us like a stone. If this was what equal love looked like, I wondered what favoritism would have been. Dad chose that moment to walk through the front door, wiping sweat from his forehead with a bandana he always carried during his rounds. He took one look at the folder on Mom's desk and the expression on my face, and his shoulders sagged like a man who'd been caught in a lie he'd been carrying for too long. "She found the will," Mom said simply. Dad's weathered face hardened, not with anger, but with the stubborn determination I'd seen him use with difficult customers. I figured this day would come eventually. He walked to his office, returned with a bottle of water, and took a long drink before looking at me directly. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know how you can justify cutting me out of everything. After I've spent 4 years keeping this place afloat," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. I want to know how you can use my credit rating to finance improvements for a business you're planning to give to someone else. I want to know how you can sit with me every week, asking for my advice and expertise, while planning to exclude me from any benefit of that expertise. Dad rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture he made when he was uncomfortable but determined to push through. It's not personal, Rachel. It's business. It's not personal? The words came out louder than I intended. Dad, this is the most personal thing imaginable. This is about family, about legacy, about the fact that I've been working for free because I thought I was building something for all of us. You weren't working for free, he said, his voice taking on an edge. We never asked you to work for free. You chose to help because you wanted to help. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost doubted my own memory. But then I remembered the countless conversations where they'd expressed gratitude for my contributions, where they'd talked about how the business was becoming our legacy, where they'd made me feel like a vital part of their future plans. You're right, I said slowly. I chose to help. Because I thought I was part of this family. Because I thought my contributions mattered. Because I thought that when you talked about the future of Sunshine Valley Storage, that future included me. Mom stepped forward, reaching for my arm. It does include you, sweetheart, just differently than we originally planned. How exactly does it include me, Mom? According to this will, I don't exist. According to your reasoning, I'm too successful to deserve consideration. According to your plan, I get to keep making loan payments on equipment that will belong entirely to Melissa. The mention of the loan seemed to hit Dad particularly hard. He set down his water bottle and looked at me with something that might have been shame. We appreciate what you did with that loan, Rachel. That was generous of you. Generous, I repeated. I didn't think I was being generous, Dad. I thought I was investing in the family business. I thought I was helping secure our collective future. Silly me for thinking that a $60,000 personal guarantee might come with some expectation of future benefit. You make good money from your consulting, Mom interjected. You don't need the income from the storage business. Melissa's still building her career. This gives her something stable to build on. I stared at both of them, trying to understand how they'd arrived at this logic. So let me get this straight. Because I've worked hard to build a successful career, I don't deserve to inherit anything from the family business. Because Melissa hasn't built a stable career yet, she deserves to inherit everything. My success disqualifies me, and her lack of success qualifies her. That's not how we see it, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then how do you see it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've decided that the daughter who contributes gets nothing, and the daughter who takes gets everything. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Mom sat back down heavily, suddenly looking much older than her 62 years. Dad stared out the window at the storage units we'd worked together to fill and maintain. Melissa has been more involved in the business lately, Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. More involved how? I asked. By posting Instagram stories about it? By doing podcast interviews where she talks about entrepreneurship without mentioning that she's never actually managed a business? By attending networking events where she represents herself as a business owner when she's never signed a business check or handled a customer complaint? She brings valuable perspective, Dad said, but even he seemed to realize how weak that sounded. What perspective, Dad? The perspective of someone who's never had to call delinquent customers? Never had to negotiate with suppliers? Never had to explain to the bank why our cash flow fluctuates seasonally? Never had to implement new software systems or train employees or handle insurance claims? She understands marketing, Mom said defensively. She understands social media and modern business promotion. I laughed, a sound that came out harsher than I intended. I increased your occupancy rate from 70% to 96% using actual marketing strategies, not Instagram posts. I developed the customer retention programs that reduced your turnover by 40%. I created the pricing structure that increased your revenue by 30% over 3 years. But sure, Melissa's lifestyle blog about desert living definitely represents superior marketing expertise. You're being unfair to your sister, Dad said, his voice taking on a warning tone I recognized from childhood. Am I? Or am I being unfair to myself by pretending that Instagram followers are equivalent to business experience? When was the last time Melissa handled a customer service crisis? When was the last time she stayed late to balance the books or came in early to meet with vendors? When was the last time she made a business decision that affected revenue or operations? Neither of them answered, because we all knew the answer. Melissa's involvement in the business was entirely superficial, designed to create content for her social media presence, rather than to actually contribute to business operations. She showed up for the pretty moments, the ribbon cuttings and community events, but she disappeared whenever there was real work to be done. She's still young, Mom said weakly. She's still learning. She's 26, Mom. I was managing major client accounts when I was 26. I was already helping you with financial planning and business strategy. At what age exactly does she become responsible for learning how to actually run a business she's going to inherit? That's different, Dad said. You've always been more. You're focused, more driven. Melissa has other interests, other talents. Other talents like traveling to influencer conferences while I handle payroll. Other interests like attending desert photography workshops while I negotiate lease agreements. I'm not saying she shouldn't pursue her interests, Dad. I'm asking why her interests qualify her to inherit a business while my actual business experience disqualifies me. The conversation was becoming circular, each of their justifications weaker than the last. I could see the discomfort in their faces, the way they kept avoiding direct eye contact, the way their explanations kept shifting and contradicting each other. They knew, on some level, that what they were doing was wrong. But they'd convinced themselves it was necessary, and now they were trapped in a web of rationalizations they couldn't escape. We just want what's best for both of you, Mom said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. What's best for me is being excluded from the family legacy I helped create. What's best for me is continuing to guarantee loans for a business I'll never own. What's best for me is working for free while you build wealth you plan to give to someone else. You don't have to keep helping, Dad said, his voice defensive. No one's forcing you to be here every Tuesday and Thursday. The statement hit me like a physical blow. After 4 years of gratitude, of expressions of appreciation, of conversations about how much they needed my help, he was now suggesting that my contributions were unwelcome burdens rather than valuable assistance. You're right, I said quietly. No one's forcing me to be here. I've been coming here because I thought I was part of something, because I thought my work mattered, because I thought I was helping build our family's future. But apparently, I was just helping build Melissa's future. That's not true, Mom said, reaching for me again. You're part of this family. You'll always be part of this family. Just not the part that inherits anything. Just not the part that benefits from all the work I've done. Just not the part that matters when it comes to the actual legacy of what we've built together. I looked around the office one more time, taking in the certificates on the walls, the photos of family milestones, the computer where I'd spent countless hours managing their finances. Everything looked the same as it had an hour earlier, but everything felt completely different. This wasn't my family's business anymore. According to their legal documents, it had never been my family's business. It was Melissa's future inheritance, and I was just temporary help. I need to think about this, I said, picking up my purse from the chair where I'd left it a lifetime ago. I need to process what you've told me and figure out what it means. for me going forward. Rachel, please don't leave angry. Mom called as I walked toward the door. We can work this out. We can find a solution that works for everyone. I paused with my hand on the door handle. What solution, Mom? You've already made your decision. You've already signed legal documents. You've already decided that my 4 years of work, my financial contributions, and my business expertise don't qualify me for inclusion in the family legacy. What exactly is there to work out? We could give you a role in the business, Dad offered. You could stay involved. Maybe take a salary for the work you do. The suggestion was so insulting I almost laughed. A role in the business that will belong entirely to Melissa? A salary paid from profits generated by a business I helped build but will never own? Dad, do you understand that you're offering to let me work for my sister in the company I saved from financial disaster? The silence that followed my question was deafening. They understood exactly what they were offering, and they understood exactly how degrading it was. But they'd painted themselves into a corner with their decision, and now they were grasping for ways to make it seem reasonable. Just think about it, Mom said softly. Don't make any hasty decisions. I opened the door, feeling the blast of desert heat that always hit like a wall when you left air conditioning in Arizona. I won't make any hasty decisions, Mom, but I won't make any more uninformed decisions either. From now on, when I make choices about this family and this business, I'll be making them with full knowledge of where I actually stand. The drive back to Phoenix felt longer than usual, the familiar desert landscape blurring past my windows as I tried to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed with text messages I didn't check, calls I didn't answer. I needed silence, needed space, needed time to understand the full scope of what I'd discovered. By the time I reached my apartment, the initial shock was wearing off, replaced by something colder and more calculating. I'd spent 4 years being naive, trusting, and generous. I'd spent 4 years assuming that family meant mutual support and shared benefit. I'd spent 4 years working under the belief that my contributions were appreciated and would be rewarded. Now I knew better. Now I understood that my strength had been seen as a reason to exploit me rather than value me. Now I realized that my success had been used as justification for excluding me rather than including me. Now I saw clearly that while I'd been building what I thought was our future, they'd been planning a future that didn't include me at all. The apartment felt different when I walked in, quieter somehow, as if the walls themselves understood that something fundamental had changed. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steadier than they'd been all morning. The shock was gone, replaced by clarity that cut through 4 years of confusion and self-doubt. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with Dad's name. I stared at it until it stopped ringing, then watched as a voicemail notification appeared. Then another call, this time from Mom, then a text message from Melissa. Mom said you found some paperwork and you're upset. Can we talk? Some paperwork. As if the legal documents that excluded me from my family's future were just random paperwork I'd stumbled across. As if my discovery of their systematic betrayal was just an unfortunate misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with conversation. I turned my phone face down on the counter and walked to my home office, the space where I managed my consulting business and handled my own financial planning. The contrast was striking. Here, I was competent, respected, valued. Here, my expertise was sought after and compensated appropriately. Here, my contributions were acknowledged and rewarded. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I kept on all my business relationships, including the informal consulting I'd been doing for Sunshine Valley Storage. 4 years of work, documented in emails, spreadsheets, reports, and recommendations. 4 years of unpaid expertise that had transformed their business from struggling to thriving. 4 years of contributions that, according to their will, meant absolutely nothing. The documentation was extensive. Email threads about expansion strategies, financial reports showing revenue growth, customer retention analyses, vendor negotiations, system implementations, marketing campaigns that actually worked rather than just looked good on social media. Every piece of evidence told the same story. I had been the primary driver of their business success over the past 4 years. But evidence of my contributions wasn't the same as evidence of promised compensation. I'd never asked for a contract, never requested equity, never demanded formal recognition of my role in their business growth. I'd operated on trust, on family loyalty, on the assumption that doing good work for people you love would naturally result in fair treatment. That assumption had been wrong. Trust had been weaponized against me. Family loyalty had been one-sided, and love had been conditional on my willingness to accept less than I deserved. I'd been generous with people who were planning to be selfish. I'd been naive with people who were being calculating. I'd been family with people who saw me as convenient labor. The phone rang again, this time showing Melissa's photo on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message she left. "Rachel, I don't know what Mom and Dad told you, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I never asked them to change their will. I didn't even know they were thinking about it. Please call me back so we can figure this out together." The message was carefully crafted, designed to sound innocent and surprised. But I remembered the lawyer's notes attached to the will, the detailed conversations about Melissa's qualifications and my disqualifications. I remembered the timeline of their decision, made not in a moment of impulse, but over weeks of planning and consideration. Most importantly, I remembered Dad's words earlier that morning. I figured this day would come eventually. This hadn't been a secret from Melissa. This had been a family decision that excluded only one family member, me. They'd all known, all planned, all agreed that my contributions meant less than her potential, that my work meant less than her social media presence, that my sacrifices meant less than her needs. The betrayal was complete, systematic, and deliberate. And now that I understood its scope, I could begin planning my response. The silence in my apartment felt different after I turned off my phone. Not empty, but expectant, like the moment before a storm when the air holds its breath. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold, staring at the stack of business cards from my consulting clients. Each card represented someone who valued my expertise enough to pay for it, someone who respected my knowledge enough to implement my recommendations, someone who saw my contributions as assets rather than obligations. The contrast was jarring. In my professional life, I was sought after, compensated fairly, and treated with the respect that comes from delivering results. In my family life, I was taken for granted, excluded from benefits, and expected to be grateful for the opportunity to work without compensation. The difference wasn't subtle, and it wasn't accidental. It was a choice my family had made about how to treat me, and it was a choice I'd been enabling by accepting it. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the financial records I'd maintained for Sunshine Valley Storage, not as their unpaid consultant, but as someone trying to understand the scope of what I'd contributed. The numbers were stark. When I'd started helping them 4 years ago, their monthly revenue averaged $42,000. Last month, they'd brought in $78,000. The growth wasn't gradual or accidental. It correlated directly with specific strategies I'd implemented, systems I'd installed, and relationships I'd cultivated. Customer retention had increased by 38% after I'd developed their follow-up protocols and loyalty programs. Occupancy rates had climbed from 71% to 94% following my market analysis and pricing restructure. Operating costs had decreased by 15% through vendor negotiations and efficiency improvements I'd researched and implemented. Even their online presence, which Melissa claimed as her expertise, had been built on search engine optimization, strategies I'd developed and content frameworks I'd created. The documentation was overwhelming. email threads spanning years, financial reports showing consistent improvement, customer testimonials praising service enhancements I'd designed. Every metric demonstrated that my involvement had transformed their business from moderately successful to genuinely thriving. Yet, according to their legal documents, this transformation had been achieved by someone else entirely. I pulled up Melissa's Instagram account, something I rarely looked at despite her frequent requests for family members to engage with her content. Her latest post featured a sunset photo taken behind the storage facility with a caption about grinding every day to build something meaningful. The post had received 237 likes and dozens of comments praising her work ethic and entrepreneurial spirit. The irony was suffocating. While I'd been actually grinding, actually building something meaningful, she'd been photographing sunsets and collecting praise for work she hadn't done. Scrolling through her feed, I found months of content about business ownership, entrepreneurship, and the challenges of growing a family company. Post after post positioned her as the driving force behind Sunshine Valley Storage's success, the visionary leader who was taking their parents' legacy to new heights. Her captions talked about late-night strategizing and making tough decisions and the weight of family responsibility. Meanwhile, I'd been the one actually staying late, actually making decisions, actually carrying the weight. The narrative she'd constructed was sophisticated and consistent. In her version of reality, she was the business-savvy daughter who'd modernized their operations and expanded their market reach. She was the marketing genius who'd transformed their brand and the strategic thinker who'd positioned them for future growth. I appeared in her story only as the supportive sister who helped with the books, a minor character in her entrepreneurial journey. But it wasn't just social media fiction. A Google search revealed that she'd been interviewed by 2 local business, podcasts, and a small-town newspaper, all discussing her role in revolutionizing the family storage business. In every interview, she spoke confidently about growth strategies, customer acquisition, and operational improvements. She referenced specific metrics and initiatives, all of which I recognized as my work presented as her achievements. The most damaging interview had been published just 3 weeks ago in the Riverside Business Journal, a regional publication that covered small business success stories. The headline read, "Young Entrepreneur Transforms Family Business Through Innovation and Dedication." The article featured a large photo of Melissa standing in front of the storage facility, arms crossed, smiling confidently at the camera. The accompanying story described how she'd implemented cutting-edge customer retention programs and developed sophisticated pricing strategies that maximized revenue while maintaining competitive positioning. Every accomplishment mentioned in the article had been my work. Every statistic cited had come from my analysis. Every strategy praised had originated from my recommendations. Yet the article presented Melissa as the architect of Sunshine Valley Storage's transformation, with only a brief mention of family support in the final paragraph. She'd stolen my professional reputation along with my inheritance, repackaging 4 years of my expertise as evidence of her own business acumen. The phone calls and text messages continued throughout the afternoon, but I ignored them all. I needed space to think, to process, to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant for my future relationship with my family. This wasn't a simple case of unfair inheritance distribution. This was systematic credit theft, professional identity appropriation, and emotional manipulation on a scale I'd never imagined possible from people who claimed to love me. By evening, I'd compiled a comprehensive record of my contributions to their business success. Bank statements showing loan payments I'd made from my personal account, email threads documenting strategic recommendations I'd provided, before and after financial reports demonstrating the impact of my involvement, customer testimonials thanking me specifically for service improvements, vendor contracts I'd negotiated, system implementations I'd managed. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But evidence of my work wasn't the same as evidence of promised compensation. I'd never requested equity in their business, never demanded formal recognition of my contributions, never established legal protections for my involvement. I'd operated on trust, family loyalty, and the assumption that doing good work would naturally result in fair treatment. That assumption had been catastrophically wrong. The next morning brought a voicemail from Dad that made my stomach turn. "Rachel, honey, your mother's been crying all night. She's worried sick that you're going to do something to hurt the family over this misunderstanding. Please call us back so we can work this out like adults. We don't want this getting ugly or involving outsiders who don't understand our situation." The message was revealing in its assumptions. They were worried about me hurting the family, as if I hadn't been the family member being hurt. They wanted to work this out, as if there was some compromise that could justify 4 years of exploitation. Most tellingly, they were concerned about involving outsiders, suggesting they understood that external perspectives would not support their position. A text from Melissa arrived an hour later. "Rachel, I know you're upset, but you're being really unfair. I never asked Mom and Dad to change their will. I've been working just as hard as you have to help the business succeed. Just because my contributions look different doesn't mean they're less valuable. Can we please talk about this like sisters instead of making it into some kind of war?" The message was masterfully crafted, designed to make me appear unreasonable while positioning her as the victim of my unrealistic expectations. She was working just as hard, implying that social media posts required the same effort as financial management. Her contributions looked different, suggesting that perception mattered more than measurable results. Most importantly, she was framing our conflict as sibling rivalry rather than professional theft and inheritance fraud. I spent the morning researching legal options, not because I was planning to sue my family, but because I needed to understand my rights and protections. What I discovered was disturbing. Because I'd never formalized my consulting relationship with their business, I had no legal claim to compensation for my work. Because I'd provided services as a family member rather than as a contracted professional, my contributions were considered gifts rather than investments. Because I'd personally guaranteed their loan without requiring equity or ownership protections, I was liable for their debt without entitled to their assets. Legally, I was exactly where they'd planned for me to be, fully responsible for their financial obligations, completely excluded from their financial benefits, and without recourse for the professional expertise I'd provided. They'd used my family loyalty against me, exploiting my trust to create a situation where I bore maximum risk while receiving minimum reward. The phone rang again, this time showing Mom's number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Rachel, sweetheart, thank God you picked up. I've been so worried about you." Her voice was strained, emotional, designed to make me feel guilty for causing her distress. "Can you please come to the storage facility so we can talk about this properly? Your father and I want to explain everything." "What is there to explain, Mom? You've made your decision. You've signed legal documents. You've excluded me from the family business I helped build." "It's not that simple, honey. There are factors you don't understand, considerations we had to weigh. Melissa has been talking to some investors about expansion opportunities. She has connections we need to explore. She brings perspectives to the business that complement your financial expertise. Investors, connections, perspectives." The language was carefully chosen to make Melissa's social media contacts sound like serious business development while minimizing my actual business development as mere financial expertise. But the mention of investors was particularly concerning, suggesting they were planning to leverage the business I'd helped stabilize for ventures I'd have no involvement in. "What investors, Mom? What expansion opportunities?" "I don't understand all the details, but Melissa has been networking with people who are interested in franchising storage facilities. They think our model could be replicated in other markets. She's been developing presentations about our growth strategies and customer acquisition methods." "Our growth strategies. our customer acquisition methods. The language was telling. Strategies I'd developed had become ours, while benefits from those strategies would be exclusively hers. Methods I'd created had become family intellectual property, while compensation for creating them would be denied to me. Mom, those growth strategies were my recommendations. Those customer acquisition methods were systems I designed and implemented. If Melissa is presenting them to investors, she's presenting my work as her own. That's not how we see it, Rachel. You were part of a team effort. Melissa coordinated with you on those initiatives. Coordinated. The euphemism was breathtaking in its dishonesty. Melissa had been present for perhaps 3 of the dozens of meetings where I'd developed those strategies. She'd reviewed final presentations I'd created and occasionally offered opinions about visual design, but coordination implied equal partnership in work she'd contributed virtually nothing to. What exactly did Melissa coordinate, Mom? Did she coordinate the market research I conducted? Did she coordinate the customer surveys I designed and analyzed? Did she coordinate the pricing models I developed? Did she coordinate the vendor negotiations I managed? Or did she coordinate by taking photos for Instagram while I did the actual work? The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Mom knew the truth about our respective contributions. She'd watched me work late into the evening while Melissa attended social events. She'd seen me handle customer complaints while Melissa was traveling for photo shoots. She'd witnessed me solving operational problems while Melissa was creating lifestyle content. But acknowledging that truth would undermine the narrative they'd constructed to justify their decision. "You're being unfair to your sister," Mom said. Finally, her voice taking on an edge I recognized as defensive anger. "Melissa works very hard at building her brand and creating opportunities for the family business. Just because her work doesn't look like yours doesn't mean it's not valuable." Building her brand, creating opportunities. The language was revealing in its priorities. Melissa wasn't building their business. She was building her personal brand, using their business as a platform. She wasn't creating opportunities for the family. She was creating opportunities for herself using family resources. The distinction was crucial, but my parents had convinced themselves that her self-promotion was equivalent to business development. "Mom, I need you to be honest with me about something. When you and Dad made this decision, did you consider the fact that I'm personally liable for $60,000 in business loans? Did you discuss what happens to that liability when Melissa inherits the business?" Another pause. Longer this time. "We assumed you'd be willing to work something out with Melissa about that." Assumed. They'd assumed I'd continue to be generous, with people who were being selfish. They'd assumed I'd continue to be accommodating with people who were being exploitative. They'd assumed I'd continue to sacrifice my interests for people who were refusing to consider my interests. What if I'm not willing to work something out, Mom? What if I decide that being personally liable for someone else's business debt, while being excluded from that business's ownership, isn't acceptable to me? Rachel, you wouldn't do that to your family. You wouldn't hurt Melissa's future over money. The accusation was stunning in its reversal of responsibility. I would be hurting Melissa by protecting myself. I would be damaging the family by refusing to accept damage. I would be motivated by money despite being the only family member willing to risk money for others' benefit. The moral framework they'd constructed painted my self-protection as selfishness while presenting their exploitation as family loyalty. This isn't about money, Mom. This is about respect. This is about acknowledgement. This is about being treated fairly by people who claim to love me. We do love you, sweetheart. We love both our daughters equally. Then treat us equally. Give us equal inheritance. Give us equal recognition. Give us equal consideration in family decisions that affect our futures. It's not that simple, she repeated, the phrase she used whenever she wanted to avoid taking responsibility for complicated situations she'd created. There are business considerations, family dynamics, long-term planning issues. You have to trust that your father and I know what's best for everyone involved. Trust. The word that had gotten me into this situation was the word they were using to keep me in it. Trust them to make decisions about my future without consulting me. Trust them to distribute family assets fairly, despite evidence to the contrary. Trust them to consider my interests despite their demonstrated willingness to sacrifice those interests for others. I trusted you for 4 years, Mom. I trusted you when I co-signed business loans. I trusted you when I worked without compensation. I trusted you when I shared my professional expertise. I trusted you when I prioritized your business over my own opportunities. That trust was a mistake. Don't say that, Rachel. Trust is what holds families together. No, Mom. Mutual respect holds families together. Fairness holds families together. Honesty holds families together. Trust without those things is just naivety, and I'm done being naive. I ended the call before she could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and emotion. The conversation had clarified everything I needed to understand about their position. They saw nothing wrong with their decision. They had no intention of reconsidering their plan. They expected me to accept exploitation gracefully and continue providing benefits while receiving none. But the conversation had also clarified something else. I was done accepting their treatment. I was done prioritizing their comfort over my dignity. I was done being generous with people who were being selfish. Most importantly, I was done being the family member who sacrificed everything while others sacrificed nothing. The next phase of my response would require careful planning, detailed documentation, and strategic thinking. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I needed to protect myself from people who had demonstrated they were willing to hurt me. Not because I was motivated by revenge, but because I was motivated by justice. Not because I wanted to destroy their family, business, but because I wanted to establish boundaries that protected my interests. 4 years of family loyalty had taught me that loyalty without reciprocity was exploitation. 4 years of generous contributions had taught me that generosity without acknowledgement was invisibility. 4 years of professional expertise had taught me that expertise without compensation was slavery. It was time to apply those lessons to my relationship with people who had forgotten that family was supposed to mean mutual support, not one-sided sacrifice. The decision to stop enabling their exploitation came gradually, then all at once. For 3 days after my conversation with Mom, I maintained my normal routine while internally dismantling 4 years of assumptions about family loyalty. I went to my regular client meetings, managed my consulting projects, and responded to business emails with the same professionalism I'd always maintained. But underneath the surface normalcy, I was conducting a methodical audit of every aspect of my relationship with Sunshine Valley Storage. The financial records were the most damning. $60,000 in loan payments, automatically deducted from my checking account on the 15th of every month. Equipment purchases I'd made using my business credit cards, totaling another $18,000 over 2 years. Professional services I'd provided at no charge, valued conservatively at $1,200 per consultation. System implementations, vendor negotiations, strategic planning sessions, customer service training, programs. By any reasonable accounting, my contributions exceeded $90,000 in direct financial impact, not including the opportunity cost of time I could have spent growing my own business. But the emotional audit was even more revealing. 4 years of Tuesday and Thursday mornings when I'd driven to Riverside instead of focusing on my Phoenix clients. Countless weekends spent updating their systems while Melissa traveled for personal projects. Evenings sacrificed to balance their books while she attended networking events where she presented my work as her own achievements. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. My time, energy, and expertise were considered unlimited resources for their benefit, while my interests were considered irrelevant to their planning. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after discovering the will, I drove to Sunshine Valley Storage for what I knew would be the last time as their unpaid consultant. The desert sunrise painted the metal buildings in shades of gold and orange, the same beautiful light that had welcomed me every week for 4 years. But today, the beauty felt hollow, like watching a sunset in a painting rather than experiencing it directly. Mom was waiting in the office when I arrived, her face showing the strain of a week spent worrying about consequences rather than acknowledging wrongs. Dad sat behind his desk, arms crossed, wearing the expression he reserved for difficult conversations he'd rather avoid. The folder containing their will sat prominently on the front counter, no longer hidden, but not exactly welcomed into the open either. "Rachel, honey, I'm so glad you came," Mom said, standing to hug me. The embrace felt performative, designed to establish normalcy rather than express genuine affection. "Your father and I have been thinking about everything you said, and we want to find a solution that works for everyone." I remained standing rather than taking the chair they'd positioned for me, a small gesture that signaled this wouldn't be a lengthy negotiation. "What solution did you have in mind?" Dad cleared his throat, launching into what was obviously a prepared speech. "We've discussed this extensively, and we think there might be room for adjustment in our estate planning. Nothing dramatic, you understand, but perhaps some recognition of your contributions that addresses your concerns." Recognition, not reversal, not reconsideration, not acknowledgement of fundamental unfairness. Recognition, as if my concerns were about receiving insufficient praise rather than systematic exploitation. "What kind of recognition?" "Well," Mom interjected quickly, "we could establish a small annual payment from the business to you, maybe $5,000 as appreciation for your consulting work. And when we're gone, Melissa could continue that arrangement as a way of honoring your contributions. $5,000 annually for work that had generated hundreds of thousands in additional revenue, paid by the sister who would inherit everything I'd helped build, conditional on her willingness to honor an informal arrangement with no legal protection." The offer was so insulting, I almost laughed. "And in exchange for this $5,000 annual payment, what would you expect from me?" They exchanged glances, neither wanting to voice the expectations they'd clearly discussed. Finally, Dad spoke. "We'd hope you could continue helping with the business operations, maybe on a more formal basis. Melissa's going to need guidance as she takes on more responsibility." There it was, the real offer. Continue working for free to train my sister, to manage the business she'd inherit, in exchange for a token payment that represented less than 10% of my actual contributions. Continue enabling their exploitation, just with slightly better optics. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You want me to continue providing professional consulting services, continue making loan payments on business debt, and continue training Melissa to run a company she'll inherit completely in exchange for $5,000 per year and her promise to maybe continue those payments after you die. That's a very negative way to characterize our offer," Mom said defensively. "It's an accurate way to characterize your offer. The negativity comes from the offer itself, not from my description of it." Dad leaned forward, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to end discussions. "Rachel, you need to be realistic about this situation. We've made our decision about the will, and that's not changing. But we're willing to find ways to acknowledge your contributions going forward. That's more than most families would do." More than most families would do. The statement revealed everything about how they viewed our relationship. Most families wouldn't exploit one child to benefit another. Most families wouldn't steal professional credit. Most families wouldn't exclude contributors while rewarding freeloaders. But in their minds, offering me crumbs from the table I'd set made them generous rather than exploitative. "You're right, Dad. Most families wouldn't do what you're offering, but most families also wouldn't do what you've done to me." "What exactly do you think we've done to you?" The question came from Mom, her voice sharp with defensive anger. We've provided you with opportunities to contribute to the family business. We've appreciated your expertise and relied on your judgment. We've included you in every major decision affecting the company's future. You've used my expertise without compensation. You've relied on my judgment while ignoring my interests. You've included me in implementing decisions while excluding me from benefiting from those decisions. There's a difference. That's not how we see it, Dad said firmly. I know it's not. That's the problem. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the positions were fixed and immovable. They saw themselves as generous parents offering opportunities for contribution. I saw them as exploitative employers using family loyalty to avoid fair compensation. They viewed my concerns as unreasonable demands for special treatment. I viewed their treatment as systematic discrimination disguised as family dynamics. When it became clear that no amount of discussion would bridge the gap between our perspectives, I pulled out the folder I'd prepared and placed it on the counter next to their will. Inside were copies of every document related to my contributions to their business success, organized chronologically and annotated with explanations of impact and value. This is documentation of everything I've contributed to Sunshine Valley. Storage over the past 4 years, I said. Financial records, strategic recommendations, system implementations, customer service improvements, vendor negotiations, marketing initiatives, everything. Dad opened the folder and began scanning the contents, his expression shifting from annoyed to concerned as he realized the scope of documentation I'd assembled. What exactly are you planning to do with this? That depends on what you're planning to do about the loan liability I'm carrying for a business I'll never own. Mom's face went pale. What do you mean? I mean that I'm personally responsible for $60,000 in business debt, plus interest, for equipment that will become Melissa's property when she inherits the company. I want to know how you plan to address that liability. We assumed you'd work something out with Melissa, Dad said, repeating the same assumption Mom had voiced during our phone conversation. I'm not assuming anything anymore. I want a clear, legally binding agreement that addresses my financial liability before I leave here today. They exchanged panicked glances. Rachel, you can't just demand immediate resolution of complex financial arrangements, Mom said. These things take time to work out properly. You've had 4 years to work them out properly. You chose to spend that time planning my exclusion instead of planning fair compensation. Now you have until I finish this conversation to provide a solution, or I'll be forced to protect my interests through other means. What other means? Dad's voice carried a warning tone I'd heard him use with problem customers. Legal means. I'll request removal from all loan agreements, demand immediate repayment of expenses I've covered, and pursue compensation for professional services I've provided. If necessary, I'll contest the validity of business loans that were obtained, using my credit for a company I was never intended to own. The threat wasn't entirely empty. I'd spent considerable time researching my legal options and had consultations scheduled with 2 attorneys who specialized in business fraud and family exploitation cases. While my position wasn't perfect, it wasn't hopeless either. More importantly, the threat of legal action would force them to confront the real costs of their decision. You wouldn't do that to your family, Mom whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. You did it to me first, I replied quietly. I'm just refusing to accept it silently. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable pauses earlier in our conversation. This was the silence of people realizing that actions have consequences, that exploitation has limits, that even family relationships have breaking points when fairness is abandoned completely. Finally, Dad spoke. What exactly do you want, Rachel? The question was asked with genuine bewilderment, as if my expectations were mysterious rather than obvious. They'd spent so much time justifying their unfair treatment that they'd lost sight of what fair treatment would look like. I want equal inheritance or compensation for the work I've done to earn it. I want recognition of my contributions instead of credit theft by Melissa. I want removal from financial liability for business assets I'll never own. And I want honest acknowledgement that what you've done to me is wrong. That's impossible, Mom said immediately. We can't just rewrite all our estate planning because you're upset about the distribution. Then we don't have anything else to discuss. I closed their folder and picked up mine, turning toward the door for what I knew would be the last time as a member of their business family. Behind me, I heard rapid, whispered conversation between my parents, urgent and desperate. "Rachel, wait," Dad called. "Let's not leave things like this. Give us some time to think about options that might address your concerns." I paused with my hand on the door handle. How much time? A few weeks, maybe a month. These are complicated issues that require careful consideration and possibly legal consultation. You have 72 hours. After that, I'll assume you've chosen to maintain your current position, and I'll take whatever steps are necessary to protect my interests. The drive back to Phoenix felt different this time. Not sad or angry, but resolved. For 4 years, I'd been operating under the assumption that family loyalty required accepting unfair treatment. I'd believed that being the strong one meant absorbing damage so others didn't have to experience it. I'd thought that generosity meant continuing to give even when receiving nothing in return. Those assumptions had been wrong, and maintaining them had made me complicit in my own exploitation. Strength didn't mean accepting mistreatment. It meant having the courage to demand better. Family loyalty wasn't one-sided sacrifice. It was mutual respect and fair treatment. Generosity without boundaries wasn't kindness. It was enabling dysfunction. The 72 hours passed without contact from my parents. No phone calls, no text messages, no emails proposing alternative solutions or requesting additional time. Their silence was an answer more definitive than any words could have been. They'd chosen to maintain their position despite understanding the consequences, betting that I wouldn't follow through on my threats. They were wrong. On Monday morning, I sent identical emails to both parents and copied Melissa. Since I haven't heard from you regarding resolution of my concerns, I'm implementing the following changes effective immediately. 1. I'm no longer available for business, consulting, or operational assistance. 2. I'm requesting removal from all business loan agreements and demanding immediate repayment of outstanding expenses. 3. I'm pursuing legal consultation regarding compensation for professional services provided without contract protection. 4. I'm considering all family business relationships terminated until further notice. The responses came quickly. Dad called within an hour, furious and threatening. Rachel, you can't just abandon family obligations because you didn't get your way. You signed those loan agreements voluntarily, and you can't just walk away from legal responsibilities. Watch. Me, I replied, and hung up. Mom's approach was emotional manipulation. Sweetheart, you're tearing this family apart over money. Is that really worth destroying relationships that have lasted your entire life? Mom, you tore this family apart when you decided I didn't deserve fair treatment. I'm just refusing to pretend that's acceptable. Melissa's response was the most revealing. Rachel, I never asked for any of this. I don't want to inherit something that causes family problems. Maybe we can work out some kind of partnership arrangement where we both benefit from the business. Partnership. After 4 years of contributing everything while she contributed nothing, she was offering partnership. After inheriting 100% of a business I'd saved, she was suggesting we both benefit. The offer demonstrated how completely she misunderstood both the scope of the injustice and the inadequacy of partial solutions. Melissa, you can't offer me partnership in something I already earned ownership of through my contributions. You can't share something that rightfully belongs to me more than it belongs to you. That's not how Mom and Dad see it. Mom and Dad are wrong, and so are you if you think accepting their decision makes you innocent of benefiting from it. The legal consultations were enlightening. While my position wasn't perfect, it wasn't hopeless either. The loan agreements I'd signed were valid and enforceable, but they were also predicated on assumptions about family business relationships that were no longer accurate. More importantly, the consulting work I'd provided had value that could be quantified and potentially recovered through civil litigation. But the lawyers also confirmed what I'd suspected. Legal action would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain in outcome. More importantly, it would permanently destroy any possibility of family reconciliation. The decision to pursue legal remedies would be final and irreversible. I took a week to consider my options. Legal action that might or might not succeed. Continued family relationships based on accepting exploitation. Complete severing of ties with people who demonstrated they were willing to sacrifice my interests for others' benefit. None of the choices were appealing, but doing nothing meant accepting continued damage. The decision came unexpectedly. Through a phone call I almost didn't answer. The caller ID showed Benjamin Hayes, attorney at law, the family lawyer, who'd handled their estate planning. I'd never spoken with him directly, but his name appeared on all their legal documents. Ms. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. Your parents listed you as an emergency contact on their business insurance, and I have some information I think you should know about. What kind of information? Information about conversations I've had with your family regarding their estate planning, conversations that were recorded with their consent for legal protection purposes. Conversations that I believe you should hear before you make any final decisions about your relationship with them. The meeting with Mr. Hayes changed everything. His law office was located in a modest strip mall between a tax preparation service and a dry cleaner, the kind of practical location that prioritized function over impression. The waiting room contained outdated magazines and motivational posters about justice and integrity, but the man himself radiated competence and ethical seriousness. Ms. Martinez, I've been practicing family law for 23 years and I've never been more uncomfortable with a case than I am with your family's estate planning, he began without preamble. What I'm about to share with you violates no attorney-client privilege because it directly relates to your interests as well as theirs. He activated a digital recording device and explained that Arizona law permitted recording of conversations in his office with client consent, something my parents had agreed to years earlier for business protection purposes. What I heard over the next hour would have been devastating if I hadn't already understood the scope of their betrayal. My mother's voice. Rachel will never know the real reasoning unless someone tells her directly. She's too trusting to suspect. We'd plan around her contributions while excluding her from benefits. My father's voice. The loan situation is perfect for us. Rachel's personally liable for the debt, but Melissa will own the asset. It's like getting free financing from someone who can't say no. Melissa's voice. I feel bad about taking credit for her work in those interviews, but Mom says it's better for the business image if people think the owner's daughter is the one driving growth rather than outside help. The recordings spanned months of conversations, revealing a level of calculation and deliberate deception I'd never imagined possible. They'd discussed using my financial contributions to stabilize the business before transferring ownership. They'd planned to maintain my loan liability while excluding me from asset ownership. They'd coordinated Melissa's public presentations of my work as her own achievements. Most damaging, they'd explicitly discussed my personality traits and emotional patterns to predict how I'd respond to various forms of manipulation. They used my strengths against me, I said after the recordings ended. Systematically and deliberately, Mr. Hayes confirmed. Ms. Martinez, in my professional opinion, what your family has done constitutes financial fraud, professional identity theft, and systematic exploitation of family relationships. You would have strong grounds for civil litigation and possibly criminal charges. Why are you telling me this? Because I can't be party to systematic fraud, even when it's committed by long-term clients. Because you deserve to know the truth about how you've been treated, and because your family is about to make their situation much worse. He explained that my parents were planning to sell Sunshine Valley Storage to a regional company that franchised storage facilities. The sale would pay off all business debts, including the loans I'd personally guaranteed, while providing them with retirement income and Melissa with ongoing management fees. But the sale was contingent on maintaining current occupancy rates and revenue levels, the exact metrics I'd improved through my consulting work. They're planning to complete this sale within 60 days, before you can take legal action to protect your interests. The sale will eliminate your loan liability, which they expect will satisfy your concerns, while providing them with substantial profit from your work. The timeline was breathtaking in its cynicism. They'd exploited my contributions to build business value, planned to exclude me from benefiting from that value, and now intended to convert that value to cash before I could establish legal claims to it. It was fraud on a scale I'd never conceived possible from people who claimed to love me. What are my options? Legally, you have several. You can file injunctive relief to prevent the sale pending resolution of your claims. You can pursue immediate compensation for consulting services through expedited litigation. You can demand forensic accounting of business value created through your contributions. You can even pursue criminal charges for fraud, though that would require convincing a prosecutor to take the case. What would you recommend? Mr. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying me with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating character. Ms. Martinez, you have every legal right to pursue maximum remedies against your family. You also have every moral right to demand justice for systematic exploitation. But legal rights and family relationships don't always align perfectly. Meaning that winning in court might cost you more than losing in court, depending on what you value most. Justice isn't always the same as satisfaction, and satisfaction isn't always the same as healing. I left his office with copies of the recordings and documentation of the planned sale, but without certainty about how to proceed. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal options were viable, and the moral justification was absolute. But the personal cost of pursuing justice would be enormous, and the outcome would be irreversible. That evening, I sat in my apartment listening to the recordings again, hearing my family discuss my exploitation with the casual efficiency of people planning a business transaction. The betrayal was complete, systematic, and undeniable. But it was also finished. They'd shown me exactly who they were and how they viewed our relationship. The question wasn't whether they deserved consequences, but whether pursuing those consequences would serve my interests or simply satisfy my anger. The decision came while I was reviewing my consulting client files, seeing the respect and fair compensation I received from people who valued my expertise, professional relationships built on mutual benefit, clear expectations, and honest communication. Everything my family relationships had lacked. I'd spent 4 years trying to fix people who didn't want to be fixed, trying to earn respect from people who'd decided I didn't deserve it, trying to build family relationships with people who saw me as a resource rather than a relative. That effort had been based on love, but it had been misdirected and ultimately self-destructive. The next morning, I sent a final email to my parents and Melissa. I've learned about your plans to sell Sunshine Valley Storage and your deliberate deception regarding my contributions to the business. Rather than pursuing legal remedies that would be costly for everyone involved, I'm choosing to end our family business relationship completely. I'll be removing myself from all loan obligations through legal means, and I'll be pursuing opportunities that provide fair compensation for my expertise. I wish you success in your future endeavors, but I won't be participating in them. The legal process of extracting myself from their business obligations took 3 months and cost me $15,000 in attorney fees. But it also provided something invaluable: complete freedom from people who demonstrated they were willing to exploit family relationships for personal gain. The sale of Sunshine Valley Storage fell through when the buyers discovered that the business improvements they were purchasing had been implemented by someone who was no longer involved and who'd never been properly compensated. Without me to maintain the systems I'd created and manage the relationships I'd developed, the business performance declined rapidly. Within 6 months, they were facing the same financial pressures that had existed before my involvement, but without the expertise to address them. I learned about their struggles through mutual acquaintances, not because they contacted me directly. The silence from my family was complete and apparently permanent. No apologies, no acknowledgement of error, no expressions of regret about lost relationships. They'd made their choice and were living with the consequences, just as I was living with mine. But my consequences were different than theirs. 6 months after severing ties with Sunshine Valley Storage, my consulting business had grown by 40%. The time and energy I'd been spending on their problems was redirected to clients who paid fair rates and respected my expertise. The emotional drain of managing family dysfunction was replaced by the satisfaction of professional relationships based on mutual benefit and clear boundaries. Most importantly, I'd learned to recognize the difference between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and enabling dysfunction, between generosity and self-destruction. Those lessons were painful but invaluable, protecting me from future relationships that would have repeated the same destructive patterns. A year later, I received an unexpected visitor at my Phoenix office. Melissa, looking older and more tired than her 27 years, asked if we could talk privately. The conversation was awkward and painful, but also illuminating. "I didn't understand what they were doing to you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you were just being dramatic about inheritance issues. I didn't realize they were using you to build something they planned to give to me regardless of who earned it. What made you realize it? When everything fell apart after you left? When I had to actually try to run the business and discovered I had no idea what you'd been doing all those years? When customers started complaining about service problems I didn't know how to fix? When vendors started demanding payments I couldn't afford? When I realized that all the expertise I'd been claiming was actually yours?" She'd come to apologize, to acknowledge the truth, and to ask if there was any way to repair our relationship. The conversation was healing in ways I hadn't expected, providing closure I hadn't realized I needed. But it also confirmed that my decision to leave had been correct. The family dynamics that had enabled my exploitation hadn't changed. They'd just lost their primary victim. "I can forgive you, Melissa, but I can't forget what happened. And I can't return to relationships that require me to accept unfair treatment." "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I know the truth now. And I'm sorry I was part of hurting you." The apology was genuine and appreciated, but it didn't change the fundamental reality. I'd built a new life based on fair relationships and clear boundaries. Returning to family dynamics that had systematically devalued my contributions would undo the progress I'd made and repeat the patterns that had caused so much damage. 2 years after leaving Sunshine Valley Storage, I opened my own business, consulting firm specializing in family business succession planning. My first client was a hardware store owner whose adult children were fighting over inheritance while contributing unequally to business operations. The situation was heartbreakingly familiar, but this time I was in a position to prevent exploitation rather than experience it. The key, I told the family during our first meeting, is establishing clear expectations about contribution and compensation before problems develop. Fair treatment isn't something you hope for, it's something you plan for and protect. The work was deeply satisfying, helping families avoid the patterns that had destroyed my own. Each successful intervention felt like redemption for the failures I'd experienced, proof that the lessons learned through painful experience could prevent others from suffering similar damage. My consulting firm grew rapidly, built on referrals, from clients who appreciated both my expertise and my understanding of family dynamics. Within 3 years, I was managing succession planning for over 40 family businesses throughout Arizona and Nevada. The success was professionally gratifying, but more importantly, it was personally healing. I'd transformed my experience of exploitation into a career helping others avoid exploitation. The final contact from my family came 5 years after I'd left their business. A brief email from Dad, informing me that Mom had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease and asking if I'd consider reconciliation given the changed circumstances. The request was typical of their approach, demanding consideration for their needs while offering no acknowledgement of their wrongs. I spent weeks considering my response, ultimately deciding that compassion didn't require accepting continued dysfunction. I sent flowers to Mom with a card expressing my wishes for her health and peace, but I didn't re-establish contact. Some relationships can't be repaired because the people involved haven't changed enough to prevent repeating the same destructive patterns. The story of my family's betrayal became part of my professional presentations, not as personal catharsis, but as educational example. I spoke at conferences about family business management, always including a section about protecting contributors from exploitation by non-contributors. The response was always intense, with audience members approaching afterward to share their own stories of family loyalty weaponized against their interests. "How do you know when to leave?" was the most common question. "When you realize that staying requires accepting treatment you wouldn't tolerate from strangers," was my standard answer. Family relationships should be held to higher standards, not lower ones. The lesson wasn't that family relationships were impossible, or that business partnerships were inherently exploitative. The lesson was that healthy relationships required mutual respect, fair treatment, and clear boundaries. Without those elements, even loving relationships could become destructive, and even generous people could enable their own mistreatment. 10 years after discovering my parents' will, I'd built a successful business, developed meaningful relationships based on mutual respect, and found peace with decisions that had initially felt devastating. The betrayal that had seemed like the end of my family relationships had actually been the beginning of healthier boundaries and more authentic connections. Most importantly, I'd learned that walking away from exploitation wasn't abandoning family values, it was honoring them. Real family relationships were built on love, respect, and fairness. Everything else was just shared genetics and convenient. Labels for dysfunctional dynamics that deserved neither loyalty nor tolerance. The strongest thing I ever did wasn't continuing to sacrifice for people who took my sacrifices for granted. The strongest thing I ever did was finally requiring them to treat me with the respect I'd been giving them all along. The text message arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 18 months after I'd last spoken to anyone in my family. I was reviewing quarterly reports for my consulting firm when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Though the area code was unmistakably Riverside, the message was brief and formal. "Ms. Martinez, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from Riverside Medical Center. Your mother, Linda Martinez, has listed you as her emergency contact. She's been admitted for complications related to her recent diagnosis. Please call when you receive this message." I stared at the screen for several minutes, my coffee growing cold as I processed the implications. Mom had kept me as her emergency contact despite our complete lack of communication. She'd maintained that connection even while refusing to acknowledge the damage she'd caused or express any regret about her choices. The gesture felt simultaneously touching and manipulative, typical of the complex dynamics that had always characterized our relationship. The drive to Riverside felt surreal, covering familiar territory I'd deliberately avoided for over a year. The desert landscape looked exactly the same. But everything felt different, viewed through the lens of distance and resolution rather than obligation and resentment. I wasn't returning as the dutiful daughter who sacrificed her interests for family harmony. I was returning as someone who'd learned to establish boundaries and protect her well-being. The hospital was small and efficient, the kind of community facility that served rural areas with competent but limited resources. Dr. Chen met me in the family consultation room, a sterile space designed for difficult conversations. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the careful professionalism of someone who'd delivered countless pieces of challenging medical news. "Your mother suffered a stroke 3 days ago," she explained, reviewing charts that contained information I should have known but didn't. It was relatively minor in terms of physical impact, but it's accelerated the progression of her Alzheimer's symptoms significantly. She's stable now, but she's going to need substantial care going forward. The diagnosis hit me with unexpected force. Alzheimer's disease was something I'd heard mentioned in Dad's brief email years earlier, but I'd assumed it was early stage and manageable. The reality was apparently much more serious than they'd let on, though their silence about family crises was hardly surprising given our history. "Where is my father?" I asked, realizing I hadn't seen him in the waiting area or received any communication from him about Mom's condition. Dr. Chen's expression shifted to something that looked like discomfort. "Mr. Martinez suffered a heart attack 6 months ago. He's in the same facility where your mother will need to be placed for long-term care. I'm afraid neither of your parents is capable of independent living anymore." The information felt like being hit by a truck I hadn't seen coming. Both parents in care facilities, both dealing with serious health crises, both apparently without the financial resources to manage their medical needs independently. The business they'd fought so hard to control, the assets they'd guarded so jealously from my participation, had apparently been insufficient to protect them when catastrophic health problems arose. "What about my sister? Why isn't Melissa handling these arrangements?" Another uncomfortable pause. "Miss Martinez has been difficult to reach. The facility administrator has been trying to contact family members for weeks about payment arrangements and care decisions. Your mother's condition has deteriorated rapidly, and there are urgent decisions that need to be made." Difficult to reach. The phrase was diplomatically vague, but its implications were clear. Melissa had inherited the family business and the responsibility for our parents' care, but she was proving unreliable when that responsibility became inconvenient or expensive. The daughter they'd chosen to prioritize over me was abandoning them when they needed her most. I asked for Melissa's current contact information and was given a phone number I didn't recognize. The call went straight to voicemail, where her recorded message mentioned being traveling for business development opportunities and promised to return calls within 48 hours. Her social media accounts, which I checked reluctantly, showed recent posts from Las Vegas conferences and networking events, with no mention of family health crises or caregiving responsibilities. The contrast was starkly familiar. When sacrifice was required, when difficult work needed to be done, when family members needed genuine support rather than social media representation, Melissa was nowhere to be found. But according to their legal documents, she was still the preferred beneficiary of their estate and the designated decision-maker for their business interests. I spent the afternoon at the hospital learning about Mom's condition and the care requirements she would need going forward. The stroke had affected her short-term memory and cognitive processing, compounding the Alzheimer's symptoms that had been progressing for several years. She would need round-the-clock supervision, specialized medical care, and eventually full residential support as her condition continued to deteriorate. The financial implications were staggering. Quality long-term care in Arizona cost approximately $8,000 per month per person. With both parents requiring residential care, the monthly expenses would exceed $15,000. Their Medicare benefits would cover some costs, but the majority would need to be paid privately through savings or family support. When I finally saw Mom in her hospital room, the physical changes were shocking. The vibrant, controlling woman, who'd managed every detail of family and business affairs, had been replaced by someone who seemed smaller, more fragile, confused by her surroundings and uncertain about familiar faces. She recognized me eventually, but it took several minutes of gentle conversation before clarity returned to her eyes. "Rachel, sweetheart, you came," she said, reaching for my hand with fingers that trembled slightly. "I wasn't sure you would. Come." The statement was loaded with implications about our estranged relationship, but her tone was vulnerable rather than manipulative. This wasn't the strategic emotional appeal I'd grown accustomed to during family conflicts. This was genuine uncertainty from someone who understood she'd damaged our relationship, but couldn't remember exactly how or why. "Of course I came, Mom. You're my mother." "I know I did something wrong," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't remember all the details, but I know you were angry with us about something important. Was it about the business? Did we hurt you somehow?" The conversation was heartbreaking in its honesty. The disease had stripped away her ability to maintain the careful justifications and rationalizations that had characterized our previous interactions. She knew she'd caused damage without being able to recall the specific actions that had created our estrangement. Part of me wanted to explain everything, to finally receive the acknowledgement I'd never gotten. But part of me recognized that punishing someone with dementia for past wrongs they couldn't clearly remember would be both cruel and pointless. "We had some disagreements about family business decisions," I said carefully, "but that's not important right now. What's important is making sure you get the care you need. Your father keeps asking about the storage business. He's worried about what happened to it, but I can't remember the details. Do you know what happened to our company?" The questions revealed how much they'd lost track of their own affairs. Sunshine Valley Storage had been sold almost a year earlier, though apparently not for the price they'd hoped to achieve. The buyer had discovered that the business improvements they were purchasing had been implemented by someone who was no longer involved, making the operation less valuable than originally assessed. The sale had generated enough money to pay off business debts and provide modest savings, but not the substantial retirement fund they'd anticipated. I learned these details from conversations with their former accountant, who'd been trying to reach family members about tax implications of the business sale and ongoing financial planning needs. The picture that emerged was of people who'd made decisions based on short-term family dynamics without considering long-term practical consequences. They'd prioritized controlling inheritance distribution over ensuring they had sufficient resources for their own care needs. Most damaging, they'd alienated the family member most capable of helping them navigate complex financial and healthcare decisions. They'd chosen emotional favoritism over practical support, and now they were paying the price for that choice. Melissa had inherited their business legacy, but proved unwilling or unable to handle the responsibility that came with it. Over the following weeks, I found myself gradually resuming contact with my parents despite our unresolved history. Not because I'd forgiven their treatment of me, but because they genuinely needed help, and there was no one else available to provide it. Melissa remained largely absent, appearing briefly when decisions needed to be made but disappearing when actual work was required. The irony wasn't lost on me. The parents who'd excluded me from inheritance because I was too successful to need their help now needed my help more than they'd ever needed anything from me. The daughter they'd prioritized because she needed more support was providing no support when they needed it most. The family dynamics that had seemed so fixed and permanent had been revealed as shallow and circumstantial when tested by real crisis. But my response was different this time. I helped them not because I hoped to repair our relationship or earn their belated appreciation, but because helping was consistent with my values regardless of how they'd treated me. I arranged their care not to demonstrate my worthiness as a daughter, but because I was the family member with the competence and resources to handle complex logistical challenges. Most importantly, I maintained clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't do. I would ensure they received appropriate medical care, but I wouldn't sacrifice my own financial security to pay for luxury accommodations they couldn't afford. I would handle necessary legal and administrative tasks, but I wouldn't pretend our relationship had been healed by their vulnerability. I would treat them with basic human dignity, but I wouldn't forget the lessons I'd learned about protecting myself from exploitation. The difference in my approach was profound. Previously, I'd helped family members while hoping for recognition, appreciation, and eventual fair treatment. Now I helped because helping was the right thing to do, independent of their response or reciprocation. The shift from conditional generosity to principled action was liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. 6 months into managing their care arrangements, I received an unexpected call from Melissa. She was back in Arizona after what she described as unsuccessful business ventures in Nevada and California. Her lifestyle blogging career had apparently stagnated, and she was facing financial pressures that made her parents' healthcare costs particularly burdensome. "Rachel, I know we haven't talked much lately, but I need to discuss Mom and Dad's situation with you," she began, her voice carrying stress I'd never heard before. "The care facility is asking for significant upfront payments, and I'm not sure how to handle the financial arrangements." The conversation that followed was illuminating. Melissa had inherited the family business as planned, but she'd discovered that inheriting something was very different from managing it successfully. Without the systems I'd developed, the relationships I'd maintained, and the expertise I'd provided, Sunshine Valley Storage had struggled to maintain the performance levels that had made it attractive to buyers. The eventual sale had occurred at a much lower price than anticipated, leaving our parents with significantly less retirement funding than they'd planned. Combined with their healthcare expenses, the financial picture was increasingly challenging. Melissa was discovering that inheritance came with responsibilities she wasn't prepared to handle. "I think I need to be honest with you about something," she continued. "I never really understood what you were doing for the business all those years. I thought you were just helping with bookkeeping and paperwork. I didn't realize you were basically running the entire operation." The admission was both validating and too late. Years earlier, acknowledgement of my contributions might have changed the trajectory of our family relationships. Now it felt like someone finally admitting the sky was blue after insisting for years that it was green. True, but insufficient to address the damage caused by the original deception. "What do you want from me, Melissa?" "I want to know if there's any way we can work together to handle Mom and Dad's care. I know I messed up. I know I took credit for things you did. I know I didn't appreciate what you were contributing to the family. But they need help now, and I can't manage everything by myself." The request was reasonable, and the acknowledgement was overdue. But I wasn't the same person who'd once sacrificed everything for family harmony. I'd learned that good intentions weren't sufficient to prevent repeated dysfunction, and that family members who'd exploited my generosity once were likely to do so again if given the opportunity. "I'm already helping with their care arrangements," I replied. "I'm handling their medical decisions, coordinating with their healthcare providers, and managing their legal affairs. What I'm not doing is providing financial support beyond what's reasonable and sustainable for my own situation." "That's fair. I wasn't asking for money. I was hoping we could coordinate our efforts so they get the best possible care." Coordination requires communication, reliability, and mutual respect. Are you prepared to provide those things consistently, or will you disappear again when the work becomes inconvenient? The question was blunt but necessary. Melissa's pattern of engagement had always been inconsistent, showing up for visibility but disappearing when sacrifice was required. If she wanted to participate in our parents' care, she needed to demonstrate sustained commitment rather than intermittent involvement. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering practical arrangements, financial responsibilities, and communication protocols. Melissa seemed genuinely committed to being more involved, but I'd heard similar promises before. This time, I insisted on specific agreements about who would handle which responsibilities, with clear consequences for failing to meet commitments. Most importantly, I made it clear that my participation was conditional on maintaining boundaries I'd established after leaving their business. I would help our parents because it was the right thing to do, but I wouldn't return to patterns of one-sided sacrifice or unacknowledged contribution. If Melissa wanted partnership in managing their care, it would be genuine partnership with shared responsibilities, and mutual accountability. Over the following months, we developed a surprisingly effective collaboration. Melissa handled day-to-day communication with care facilities and medical providers, while I managed financial planning and legal arrangements. She provided emotional support and social interaction, while I handled complex administrative tasks that required business experience. The division of labor played to our respective strengths while avoiding the competitive dynamics that had characterized our previous interactions. The key difference was that our collaboration was based on explicit agreements rather than assumptions about family loyalty. We documented who was responsible for what, established regular communication schedules, and created accountability measures for ensuring commitments were met. It was more formal than typical sibling relationships, but it was also more functional than our previous dysfunction. Most surprisingly, Melissa proved more reliable than I'd expected when given clear expectations and specific responsibilities. Her previous inconsistency had been enabled by family dynamics that allowed her to contribute minimally while receiving maximum benefit. When expectations were explicit and consequences were real, she rose to meet them more effectively than anyone had anticipated. The experience taught me something important about family relationships and personal boundaries. Cutting toxic people out of your life completely is sometimes necessary for self-protection. But sometimes the toxicity comes from dysfunctional patterns and unclear expectations rather than fundamentally bad character. When those patterns are disrupted and expectations are clarified, relationships that seemed irreparably damaged can sometimes be rebuilt on healthier foundations. However, rebuilding required genuine change from all parties involved. It required acknowledgement of past wrongs, commitment to different behavior, and acceptance of new boundaries. Most importantly, it required recognizing that trust, once broken, had to be earned back through consistent actions rather than promised through emotional appeals. 2 years after resuming contact with my parents, Dad passed away peacefully in his care facility. The end came relatively quickly after a second heart attack, and he was lucid enough in his final days to have meaningful conversations with both Melissa and me. His last words to me were an apology that felt both inadequate and genuine. "I'm sorry we didn't treat you fairly, Rachel. You deserved better from us." The acknowledgement was something I'd waited years to hear, but it came too late to repair the damage caused by their choices. Still, it provided a form of closure that allowed me to grieve his death without the additional burden of unresolved anger. He'd been wrong about many things, but he'd been my father, and his final recognition of my worth mattered more than I'd expected. Mom's condition continued to deteriorate gradually, but she had moments of clarity that allowed for meaningful connection. During one particularly lucid afternoon, she looked at me with eyes that seemed to see clearly for the first time in months. "I remember now what we did to you," she said quietly. "We took your work and gave it to Melissa. We used your money and excluded you from benefits. We treated you badly because we thought you were strong enough to handle it." The conversation was painful but necessary, providing acknowledgement I'd never received when she was fully cognitive. "Why did you do it, Mom?" "Because we were afraid. Melissa wouldn't be okay without extra help, and we knew you would be okay no matter what happened. It was wrong, but it felt like protecting the weaker child at the time." It wasn't protecting her. It was handicapping me and enabling her. You taught her she didn't need to develop competence because someone else would always handle the difficult work. I know that now. I wish I could change what we did, but I can't. All I can do is tell you that you were right to leave when you did. You were right to protect yourself from people who weren't protecting you. The validation was powerful, coming from someone who'd been instrumental in creating the dysfunction I'd escaped. It didn't erase the years of exploitation or the damage to our relationship, but it provided the maternal acknowledgement I'd always craved. More importantly, it confirmed that my decision to establish boundaries had been correct, even when it felt cruel at the time. Mom passed away 18 months, Later, her final decline relatively peaceful thanks to the quality care we'd arranged. Melissa and I had worked together effectively throughout the process, maintaining our collaboration despite the emotional difficulty of watching our parents' deterioration. The experience had been challenging, but also healing, providing opportunities to build a different kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than competitive dynamics. The estate settlement was straightforward, since most assets had been spent on healthcare expenses. There was no significant inheritance to distribute, no family business to transfer, no material wealth to fight over. The will that had once excluded me so completely was largely irrelevant, since there was little left to inherit beyond personal possessions and sentimental items. But something unexpected happened during the estate settlement process. Melissa voluntarily signed documents transferring ownership of our parents' personal belongings to both of us equally, despite the will's language giving her exclusive rights to their possessions. She also insisted on splitting the small amount of remaining savings, even though legally she was entitled to everything. "This is what should have happened from the beginning," she explained when I questioned her decision. "Equal treatment, equal inheritance, equal recognition. I can't fix what Mom and Dad did wrong, but I can fix what I'm doing now." The gesture was meaningful, representing genuine acknowledgement of past unfairness and commitment to different behavior going forward. It didn't erase the years of exploitation or restore the professional reputation that had been stolen through credit theft, but it demonstrated that people could learn from their mistakes and choose better actions when given the opportunity. 5 years after resuming contact with my family, I reflected on the journey from exploitation to estrangement to cautious reconciliation. The experience had taught me crucial lessons about relationships, boundaries, and self-protection that informed every aspect of my personal and professional life. The most important lesson was that walking away from toxic relationships isn't abandoning family values. It's protecting them. Real family relationships are built on mutual respect, fair treatment, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Everything else is just shared genetics and emotional manipulation disguised as love. But I also learned that people can change. Relationships can be rebuilt, and boundaries can create space for healthier interactions. Not always, and not easily, but sometimes. The key is maintaining standards for how you deserve to be treated, while remaining open to evidence that others are capable of meeting those standards consistently. My consulting practice continued to grow, specializing in helping families navigate business succession and inheritance planning without destroying relationships through unfair treatment. Every client consultation reminded me why the work was important and why the lessons I'd learned through painful experience needed to be shared with others facing similar challenges. The most common question I received was still, "How do you know when to leave?" And my answer had evolved based on my experience with both cutting ties and rebuilding relationships. You leave when staying requires accepting treatment that damages your well-being, but you remain open to return if the treatment genuinely changes and the relationship becomes mutually beneficial. The qualification was important. Leaving toxic relationships was often necessary for self-protection, but permanent estrangement wasn't always the optimal outcome if people were genuinely capable of change. The key was maintaining boundaries that protected your interests while being open to evidence that others were willing to respect those boundaries consistently. Melissa and I had developed a relationship that worked for both of us, built on explicit expectations rather than family obligation. We saw each other occasionally for holidays and special occasions, maintained regular communication about practical matters, and even collaborated on some professional projects where our skills complemented each other effectively. But our relationship was fundamentally different from typical sibling connections. It was more formal, more conditional, more carefully managed. We both understood that our ability to maintain positive interactions depended on respecting boundaries that had been established through painful experience. The trust that had been broken through years of exploitation couldn't be fully restored, but it could be replaced with something more sustainable: mutual accountability. The experience had changed my perspective on family relationships in ways that extended far beyond my immediate family. I was more careful about setting expectations with extended family members, more explicit about reciprocity in friendships, more protective of my time and energy in all personal relationships. I'd learned that being generous didn't require being naive, that loving someone didn't mean accepting mistreatment from them, and that family loyalty was only valuable when it was mutual. Most importantly, I'd learned that the strongest thing you can do isn't enduring exploitation silently. It's requiring the people who claim to love you to demonstrate that love through fair treatment. Sometimes that means walking away from relationships that can't be made healthy. Sometimes it means establishing boundaries that create space for relationships to become healthy. But it always means refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth or damages your well-being. The little girl who'd once believed that being strong meant accepting whatever treatment family members chose to give had grown into a woman who understood that real strength meant requiring the respect she deserved. That transformation had been painful, costly, and sometimes lonely, but it had also been necessary for building a life based on authentic relationships rather than convenient exploitation. 10 years after discovering my parents' will, I'd built not just a successful business, but a life filled with relationships based on mutual respect and fair treatment. Some of those relationships were with clients who valued my expertise enough to compensate it fairly. Some were with friends who demonstrated loyalty through actions rather than just words. And yes, some were with family members who'd learned to treat me with the respect I'd always deserved but hadn't always required. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of everything important had actually been the beginning of everything authentic. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most teach you the most valuable lessons about protecting yourself and building better relationships. Sometimes the family that abandons you forces you to create a chosen family that actually supports you. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best life you could have imagined. But most importantly, sometimes walking away from people who don't value you creates space for relationships with people who do. And that space, that freedom, that possibility for genuine connection based on mutual respect is worth every difficult conversation, every uncomfortable boundary, every moment of uncertainty about whether you're doing the right thing. You are. You always were. And the people who can't see your worth don't deserve access to your life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Out!